Have you ever spent your whole life being the quiet one, only to realize your silence was mistaken for insignificance? This is the story of Lauren Bennett, the overlooked younger sister in a family that never saw her coming. While her brother basked in the spotlight, Lauren built a silent empire, brick by brick, deal by deal, until the day her path crossed with his in the most unexpected way. A corporate acquisition that flipped the family dynamic upside down, set against the backdrop of high-stakes business and deeper emotional reckoning. Parallel Tracks is a journey of reclamation, resilience, and redefined relationships. It's about learning when to stay silent and when to finally speak. Because sometimes the biggest revenge isn't loud, it's thriving and letting them watch. Chapter 1. The Shadow Years. People assumed I was lucky to have a brilliant brother. No one asked what it was like to live in his shadow. My earliest memories always had Ethan at the center. He was the one who cracked his first joke before turning 2, solved Rubik's Cubes before 3rd grade, and built his first computer the same summer I was still learning how to braid friendship bracelets. At family gatherings, relatives would ruffle his hair and call him our little genius. No one really noticed the girl sitting quietly beside him, coloring neatly within the lines. By the time I was 10 and Ethan was 12, the hierarchy had already formed, unspoken but unmistakable. He was the prodigy. I was the nice little sister who cheered him on. And I did. I clapped at his science fair trophies, listened to him explain coding languages I couldn't pronounce, and watched him be ushered into rooms I was too young or too ordinary to enter. Our parents, Charles and Diane Bennett, were loving, well-meaning people. Dad was a numbers man, a tax accountant who still struggled to set up the voicemail on his phone. Mom taught English literature at the local high school and had an impressive knack for reciting Shakespeare at dinner. They weren't trying to play favorites, but when Ethan spoke about neural networks and motherboard integrations, Dad looked at him like he was speaking a divine language. When I showed them the marketing plan I'd made for a school project, Dad said, "That's sweet, honey. Maybe you can help Ethan promote one of his inventions someday." I learned early to smile through disappointment. It became second nature. The only person who ever seemed to notice I had my own light was Grandma Eleanor. She wasn't like the other adults in my life. At 78, she carried a weathered iPad everywhere, followed tech blogs religiously, and had a sharper memory than most people half her age. She'd been a mathematics professor back when women in academia had to fight tooth and nail for recognition. Maybe that's why she saw me in a way others didn't. I remember one Christmas during college, I was home for break and Ethan was mid-rant about his Google internship using jargon like machine vision optimization and distributed systems. Mom nodded with a glazed-over smile. Dad beamed like he just heard a sermon from a prof. I'd spent weeks preparing a presentation on how social behavior influences consumer trust in tech products. No one asked about it. Later that night, while I helped Eleanor refill the coffee urn in the kitchen, she looked at me and said, "They don't see it yet, Lauren, but I do. You understand people and systems. That's rare. That's valuable. Don't let the volume of someone else's brilliance drown out your own frequency." It was the kind of sentence that lodged in your chest and stayed there. Back on campus, I buried myself in my business classes. I focused on strategy, leadership, human-centered design. Things Ethan would scoff at as soft, but I knew better. I wasn't trying to be like him anymore. I was trying to be useful in my own way. After graduation, I landed a marketing analyst position at a small but promising tech firm in Seattle called Ridgepoint. It wasn't flashy, but I was determined to learn. I didn't just study customer data, I studied the product itself. I asked engineers questions most marketers didn't. I asked my engineers the questions they got asked every day. I took online courses in product management, brushed up on UX/UI basics, and eventually coding fundamentals, not because I wanted to code, but because I wanted to understand the people who did. Ethan, of course, was unimpressed. At my graduation dinner, he raised a glass and said with a smirk, "To Lauren, making brochures look exciting since 2014. Laughter followed, polite but unkind. Held my smile like armor. But something in me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, strategically. I promised myself that night. One day, he'll realize I wasn't just the girl in the background. I didn't need applause. I needed agency. At Ridgepoint, I worked longer hours than anyone expected from a junior hire. I volunteered for late-night product launches, handled crisis meetings with clients, and slowly earned the trust of both the marketing and development teams. The CTO once said during a cross-functional meeting, "Lauren's the only one here who can explain what we build and why anyone should care." It was the first time I realized my hybrid skill set, half business, half empathy, wasn't a weakness. It was leverage. 3 years in, I was promoted to marketing director. 2 years after that, I was headhunted by Stratus Tech, one of the fastest-growing enterprise software companies on the West Coast. Stratos was different, bigger, bolder, and ruthless in the best and worst ways, but I was ready. I joined as a product strategist and climbed quickly. Strategy turned into business development turned into acquisitions. By the time I was 32, I was overseeing a team of 15 and reporting directly to the CSO. And still, when I called home, the first question was always about Ethan. "How's your brother doing with his startup? Did you see the article about Nexora in Tech Insider? Ethan says machine learning will transform the next decade. Do you agree?" No one asked what I did at Stratos. No one asked how many companies I'd evaluated, acquired, or integrated in the past fiscal year. At Thanksgiving, Ethan held court like always, describing seed rounds and venture capital with performative flair. He said things like the vision always comes before traction, and you don't scale until you burn. My father nodded in awe. I passed the mashed potatoes. To them, I was still the girl with a good job in marketing, but Ethan was burning faster than anyone knew. His company, Nexora, had once been hyped as the future of predictive analytics for enterprise clients, but he had no clear monetization strategy, no marketing infrastructure, and no operations lead strong enough to scale. He'd built a Ferrari engine with no dashboard, no brakes, and no map. I knew none of this, of course, until the day his company showed up in my acquisition pipeline. The first time I saw the report, I almost laughed. It had come across my desk like any other potential target. Good tech, great engineers, bad business fundamentals. Burn rate unsustainable, my assistant Parker had noted. Strong intellectual property, but they'll be underwater in 3 quarters. A classic salvage case. And then I saw the founder's name, Ethan Bennett. I stared at it for a long time. Long enough for the screen to dim. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain if I should flag it, delete it, or forward it without comment. I didn't do any of those things. I printed it. I took the file home that night, stared at it over takeout Thai and a glass of wine, and reread every line. Everything Ethan had dismissed about my career. Market alignment, product positioning, cost to acquire metrics, were the exact reasons his company was failing. The irony was almost cinematic. I considered calling him. I didn't. Instead, I made an appointment with Monica Reynolds, my CSO. When I told her about the conflict of interest, she raised an eyebrow. "Your brother?" "Yes," I said evenly, "but I can be professional." "You'll recuse yourself from direct negotiations," she said. "Of course. But stay in advisory? We'll need your insights." I nodded, thinking, you'll need more than that. Over the next month, I watched from a careful distance as our team dove into Nexora. Due diligence confirmed what I already knew. Brilliant code, broken strategy. But the tech was worth saving. I didn't advocate for it out of loyalty. I did it because it was a good acquisition. And that's what I was paid to do. What Ethan didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that I was the one who'd put Nexor on Stratus's radar in the first place. What he also didn't know, we were about to finalize the deal, just in time for Easter. I didn't plan for the truth to come out over dinner. But sometimes the table becomes the battlefield. What happens when the sibling who's always been ignored holds the fate of the family's golden child in her hands? Have you ever been underestimated for so long that success starts to feel like revenge? Don't miss Chapter 2, where silent power meets a crumbling ego and the game of truth begins. Chapter 2. The corporate underdog. When your brother calls your job a safe zone for non-coders, you stop inviting his opinion. By the time I turned 30, my title at Stratus Tech was longer than my mother could ever remember in one breath. Director of Product Strategy and Business Growth Initiatives, a role that essentially meant I was the bridge between engineers who spoke in code and executives who spoke in money. Most days, I lived in the space between them, translating vision into viability. It was a language Ethan had never bothered to learn. When he spoke about his startup, Nexora, it was with the confident swagger of someone who had read too many founder biographies and believed disruption was a personality trait. Over family dinners and Zoom catch-ups, he dropped phrases like first mover advantage, proprietary AI models, and pre-seed validation. I used to smile through them, correcting his metrics only in my head. He rarely asked about my work, and when he did, it was usually followed by some version of, "That's cool, but it's not really tech." As if managing multi-million-dollar integrations was just glorified PowerPoint design. At Stratos, I didn't need his validation. What I needed was data, insights, leverage, and over the years, I'd built a reputation for seeing patterns early, recognizing which startups were riding hype and which ones were solving real problems. That instinct was how Nexora landed in our crosshairs. Ironically, it wasn't even flagged by me initially. Parker, my sharp and under-caffeinated analyst, handed me a report during a Thursday morning briefing. "Small team, promising IP, burning through cash," he said, sliding the file across the table. "They've got an edge in adaptive predictive modeling, one of the cleanest applications I've seen this quarter. But they're going to tank if they don't restructure soon." I scanned the one-page summary, nodding until my eyes froze on the founder's name, Ethan Bennett. A beat passed before I looked up. "We'll keep this one in consideration," I said evenly. Later that day, I sat in my office, staring at the full portfolio brief on Nexora. Their tech was good, undeniably. Their adaptive model could genuinely improve Stratos' core offerings. But the business side was a disaster. They had no market segmentation, no scalable sales funnel, and a laughably overestimated CAC to LTV ratio. It was exactly the kind of acquisition target we looked for: brilliant engineers with no idea how to commercialize. For a few hours, I toyed with the idea of quietly passing the report to another team. Let someone else handle it. Let the machine absorb Ethan without him ever knowing I was connected to it. But the strategist in me knew better. This wasn't just personal, it was professional. And as much as I disliked how Ethan had always treated me, I wouldn't let that cloud my judgment. If anything, my proximity gave me unique insight into what Nexora needed to succeed, if it could be saved at all. That evening, I requested a private meeting with Monica Reynolds, our Chief Strategy Officer. Monica was sharp, direct, and allergic to drama. I respected her immensely. She respected results. When I walked into her glass-walled corner office, I handed her the Nexora file and said, "There's a conflict of interest I need to disclose." She raised an eyebrow. "Family?" "My brother." Her other eyebrow joined the first. "He's the founder?" "Yes." She flipped through the packet, expression unreadable. "You've done your review?" "Initial only. I haven't spoken to him about it, and I won't be part of direct negotiation." "You're sure you can keep boundaries clean?" I nodded. "Professional distance isn't a problem." If anything, it's necessary." Monica gave a small, amused huff. "You really don't like him, do you?" I hesitated. "It's not that. I just know how he sees people like me." She closed the folder and tapped the desk. "You'll stay on in an advisory capacity. No emails, no direct calls. All input goes through me or legal. Understood?" As I left her office, I felt something strange settle in my chest. Not guilt, not revenge. Something in between. Like truth, sharpening its teeth. The thing about truth? It doesn't stay in the shadows forever. In the weeks that followed, I played a delicate game of observation from the sidelines. Monica's team handled all direct communications with Nexora while I reviewed internal strategy notes, technical assessments, and risk projections. I kept my name off emails. I didn't attend any calls. But behind closed doors, I was the quiet architect shaping our understanding of Ethan's company, layer by layer, truth by truth. And the truth was messy. Nexora had solid code. I would never take that from him. Their adaptive learning engine was elegant, efficient, and surprisingly scalable. But the infrastructure surrounding that innovation was brittle. They'd overspent on platform architecture without securing long-term contracts. They had no formal go-to-market strategy. Their entire financial plan hinged on another Series B round they were unlikely to land. Parker called it classic founder hubris. I didn't disagree. Every time I read a line in their investor deck about disrupting traditional enterprise forecasting, I could hear Ethan's voice in my head, so certain, so dismissive of anything resembling business fundamentals. He had always spoken like he was playing a different game, one where soft skills were weaknesses and strategy was for people without real intelligence. It made me furious in ways I hadn't admitted before. And yet, I still advocated for the deal, not because of him, but because the technology was good. And because the team, excluding its founder, deserved a chance to keep building in a more stable environment. I'd seen too many great engineers fail because they hitched themselves to the wrong ego. Ethan's ego was just particularly familiar. Ryan, my boyfriend, noticed the shift in me almost immediately. "You've been quieter than usual," he said one evening as we ate dinner on the balcony of our apartment. He was grading history essays. I was rereading Nexara's risk report. I looked up. "Just work?" "The usual kind of work, or the kind that's also a family drama waiting to happen?" I gave him a look. He smirked. That's what I thought. Ryan had always been a safe harbor, calm, observant, unaffected by the tech world's ego storms. He was the only person I'd told about the Nexara situation in full. And he didn't offer advice or judgment. He just asked one question. "What do you need from this, Lauren? Closure, justice, validation?" I hadn't answered. I still wasn't sure. The acquisition process moved quickly. Stratus had been circling the predictive analytics space for months, and Nexora's tech fit snugly into our long-term product roadmap. Within 3 weeks, our executive team approved the deal structure. Monica sent word. The final offer would go out next Friday, 1 week before Easter. When I saw the email, I stared at the calendar for a long time. The irony was suffocating. Ethan would likely find out about the acquisition just days before he showed up at our parents' house for ham and awkward small talk. Would he know by then that Stratos Tech was behind the buyout? That his sister had been in the room where the decision was made? I doubted it. He hadn't mentioned anything in the family group chat, which remained its usual parade of baby photos, dinner invites, and Ethan's unsolicited links to podcasts about visionary leadership. Part of me wanted to warn him, to call and say, "Hey, just so you're not blindsided, here's what's happening." But another part, the part that remembered years of being diminished, ignored, patronized, stayed quiet. Instead, I called Grandma Eleanor. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You've done nothing wrong, sweetheart. You've been professional, ethical, and fair. If the truth unsettles him, that's not your burden. "It's going to be awkward." "Perhaps," she said gently, "but awkwardness is where honesty begins. Don't protect his ego at the cost of your truth." Her words settled over me like a slow thaw. That weekend I made the decision. I wouldn't hide my involvement if asked, but I wouldn't volunteer it either. Let Ethan say what he wanted. Let the family believe what they'd always believed. Let the truth come to the table when it was ready. And it was getting very, very close. He was about to toast to his victory, and I was about to serve the truth he never saw coming. What happens when the person you've always dismissed is the one holding the pen on your company's fate? Have you ever stayed silent? Not out of fear, but to see how far someone would go with their version of the truth? Join me in Chapter 3, where Easter dinner becomes the stage for a reckoning years in the making. Chapter 3. The Easter Setup. He toasted to his success with a smile. I chewed my dinner beside the truth. The sun was unnaturally bright for an Easter Sunday in Portland. Spring had officially arrived. Blooming dogwoods in our parents' yard, soft wind brushing through the curtains, and the smell of honey-glazed ham wafting from the kitchen. On the surface, everything was exactly as it had always been. That was the thing about family traditions. They made it easy to pretend nothing had changed. Ryan and I pulled into the driveway a few minutes before noon. He reached over and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've done nothing wrong," he said gently, echoing the words Eleanor had told me just days before. "And I'm here for moral support, even if it gets weird." "It's going to get weird," I muttered, stepping out of the car. The front door swung open before we knocked. Mom greeted us with her signature high-energy hug, already flushed from oven heat and social adrenaline. "Lauren, Ryan, you're just in time. Everyone's here except Aunt Carol and Uncle Mike. Come in, come in." Inside, the house buzzed with familiar chaos. Kids' laughter filtered from the backyard. Kitchen timers beeped in the background. Voices layered over each other like overlapping threads in a quilt. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing by the fireplace in the living room, dressed in a navy blazer far too polished for a casual family gathering. Heather stood next to him, smiling politely as he gestured animatedly with a glass of wine. Dad and Uncle Mike were seated, nodding along like they were listening to a TED Talk. I couldn't hear what Ethan was saying yet, but I could already tell from his body language he was in full performance mode. Heather noticed me first. Her face lit up with genuine warmth as she stepped forward. "Lauren, hey," she said, pulling me into a quick, sincere hug. "It's been too long." Ethan turned at the sound of her voice. He nodded at me, then at Ryan. "Hey, sis, Ryan." His tone was flat, his eyes already drifting back to his audience. "Still on the same corporate ladder?" he asked without waiting for an answer. Then to the group. "Anyway, as I was saying, timing is everything in this market. You have to know when to exit. Exit." I inhaled quietly, the word catching in my chest like a fishbone. So this was the story he was going to tell. Ethan had no idea who was behind the acquisition of his company. Or maybe he did, and he was choosing to pretend otherwise. Either way, the fiction had begun. I glanced at Ryan, who raised a subtle eyebrow in silent question. I shook my head, wordlessly. Not yet. We moved to the kitchen under the pretense of helping Mom, who gladly handed me a tray of deviled eggs. Grandma Eleanor was there already, arranging sliced carrots with surgical precision onto a serving platter. She looked up as I entered, her eyes scanning my face like a polygraph machine. "Still quiet?" she asked softly. "He's in full myth-making mode," I said, setting down the tray. According to him, the acquisition was a strategic exit. His idea, perfectly timed. She snorted. "Of course it was." "Do I let him run with it?" Eleanor handed me a serving spoon, her face calm and unreadable. "Tell the truth if asked. Don't humiliate him. Just don't disappear." I nodded, but my stomach was already tightening. The truth wasn't the hard part. The hard part was how easily the lie fit the family's narrative. Ethan had always known how to spin a story, and our parents had always been willing to believe it. And as we carried the food into the dining room, I realized this Easter wouldn't be about eggs or ham. It would be about the moment silence became a form of betrayal. Dinner was served with the usual fanfare, Mom's famous honey-glazed ham taking center stage, flanked by scalloped potatoes, roasted vegetables, and the green bean casserole that had somehow become a family staple. The good china made its annual appearance, along with crystal wine glasses that looked elegant but clinked too loudly. Ethan, of course, had positioned himself at the center of the table, across from Dad, perfectly angled to command attention. I took a seat near one end between Ryan and Grandma Eleanor. I'd barely unfolded my napkin before Ethan resumed his monologue. "It's all about anticipating market shifts," he said, carving into his ham like a man cutting deals. "We saw the plateau coming, positioned ourselves for acquisition before the dip. Honestly, it couldn't have been better timed." Dad nodded appreciatively. "Sounds like you made a smart move, son." "It's what separates founders from followers," Ethan said, shrugging with false modesty. "You have to know when to cash out. Not everyone can handle the pressure of innovation." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Lauren works in tech too, right, Ryan?" Ryan looked up, startled to be addressed. "She does," he said. "She's actually—" Ethan cut him off with a chuckle. "Marketing, right? Something with user engagement?" I bit the inside of my cheek. Grandma's fork paused mid-air. Mom, bless her, tried to pivot. "Lauren's been promoted several times, Ethan. She's doing very well." "I'm sure she is," he said, smiling the way people do when they're already bored of the topic. "But let's be honest, corporate tech's where ideas go to die, startups are where the real work happens." The room fell into a tense silence. Even Heather looked uncomfortable, eyes focused on her plate. I felt Ryan's hand find mine under the table. I didn't say anything, not yet. Ethan carried on, oblivious or uncaring. "The problem with most people in tech is they don't build anything. They manage, they market, they sit in meetings. But real innovation? That takes risk. It takes vision. Not everyone has that." He turned toward me then, his voice lower but still performative. "No offense, Lauren. I know you work hard. But it's different when you're actually in the arena." I looked at him steadily. "You mean the arena where your company was 3 missed payrolls from collapse?" The words were out before I decided to say them. Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" The entire table went still. Grandma Eleanor cleared her throat. "She means the arena where Stratos Tech acquired Nexora," she said calmly, setting down her wine glass. "Because your sister, Lauren, is the one who brought it to their attention." Borks stopped mid-air. Dad's eyes widened. Mom gasped softly. Ethan stared at me like the table had just flipped. "You're joking," he said, looking between us. I met his eyes. "No, I'm the director of strategic acquisitions at Stratos Tech. I've held the role for almost 2 years." Heather whispered. "I saw her name on the paperwork. I assumed you knew." "You knew and didn't say anything?" Ethan's voice cracked. "You set this up. You came after me." I kept my tone steady. "I didn't come after you. I flagged your company because the tech had potential, but the business couldn't survive on its own." "That's not personal, Ethan. That's a fact." He pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped violently across the hardwood. "You had no right. You had no interest in what I did. Until now. You think you saved me?" "I think I did my job." The silence that followed was seismic. Finally, Ethan turned and stormed out of the room. A few seconds later, the front door slammed shut. Everyone else remained frozen in place. It was Uncle Mike who broke the stillness, murmuring, "Well, that escalated." Aunt Carol looked at me with a kind of stunned reverence. "Lauren, why didn't you ever tell us what you really do?" I exhaled slowly, my voice soft but unwavering. "I guess no one ever asked, and now that they had, the story wasn't just his anymore. It was mine, too. What happens when the sibling who's always been overlooked finally speaks and the entire room goes silent? Have you ever buried the truth so long it hurt more to say it than to keep it hidden? Don't miss Chapter 4, where confrontation moves to the porch and the line between rivalry and redemption begins to blur. Chapter 4. Truth on the Porch. When the door slammed shut behind him, the silence he left behind said everything he couldn't. I didn't chase him right away. Instead, I sat there in the thick, stunned stillness of a family dinner gone off script. No one moved. The silverware stayed frozen mid-air, the wine glasses untouched. The only sound was the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a rhythm too calm for what had just exploded. Mom looked pale. Dad looked unsure, like someone had pulled the rug out from under his long-held version of things. Heather stared down at her plate, lips pressed tight. Even the kids outside had gone quiet, like the ripple of Ethan's outburst had found its way into the backyard breeze. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with the quiet grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime knowing when not to make noise. "I'm going to talk to him," I said. No one stopped me. I found him on the front porch, pacing. His blazer was off, sleeves rolled up, hands clenched like he wanted to fight something, but all he had was air. He didn't look at me when I stepped out. "You humiliated me," he said without turning around. "I told the truth," I replied. "You just didn't expect it to come from me." Ethan turned then, eyes sharp, chest heaving slightly. "You think this was justice? You think this was your moment to finally prove something?" "No," I said calmly. "I think this was the first time I didn't let you write the whole story." He laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "You always needed to make everything so moral, so clean. But you don't know what it's like to build something from scratch, with nothing but an idea and a clock ticking down on your runway." "I do," I said. "I just didn't need the spotlight to survive it." That stopped him. He leaned against the porch railing, finally quiet. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the big maple tree out front. For a moment, we were just two people breathing in the stillness. Siblings with too many years of distance and silence between us. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "You wouldn't have heard me," I replied. "You never did." And now that he had no choice but to listen, I wondered if the truth would finally echo louder than his pride. Ethan didn't speak for a while. He stood with his back to me, gripping the porch railing like he needed something solid to hold on to. The spring air had cooled. Clouds moved lazily across the fading sky, casting long shadows across the yard. From inside, the low murmur of resumed conversation drifted out, but out here, it felt like we were in a pocket of still time, where old wounds could breathe. "I wasn't always like this," he said eventually. "You know that, right?" I stayed quiet. Let him find his own way to the words. "I used to build things because I loved it. Not for applause, not for exits. But somewhere along the way I started needing it. The attention, the validation, it was like fuel, and when it dried up, I panicked. I crossed my arms." "That's not an excuse, Ethan. I know," he said, turning to face me now. "But it's the truth." His eyes weren't full of fire this time. They were tired, and something else, something I hadn't seen in him in years. Fear. Of failure. Of not being the favorite. Of being forgotten. "I spent so long thinking you were just there," he said. "Background. The one who followed rules, kept her head down. I never asked what you were building, and now I find out you've been outpacing me quietly, and I—" He stopped himself, shook his head. It scared the hell out of me. I wasn't trying to outpace you, I said. I just stopped waiting for you to notice. We stood in silence again, but it was different this time. Softer. Almost human. Finally, Ethan sighed. Is it too late to fix this? That depends, I said carefully. Are you asking because you want to be my brother again or because you're trying to salvage your ego? He gave a half smile, the first real one of the day. Maybe both, but mostly the first. His eyes exhaled. Then start by listening, and stop assuming you know my story better than I do. He nodded, slowly. Deal. We didn't hug. That wasn't us. But we stood a little closer after that. The kind of proximity that said something was shifting. If not healed, then at least acknowledged. Behind us, the front door creaked open. Mom peeked out, her voice tentative. Are you two okay? Ethan glanced at me, then back at her. We're working on it. She nodded, visibly relieved. Dessert's coming out. Grandma's threatening to serve it with or without you. We'll be in soon, I said. As she disappeared inside, Ethan turned to me again. You're really good at your job, aren't you? I smiled, just slightly. I am. And for the first time, I wasn't shrinking to say it. But inside, I knew the real reckoning wasn't over. Because tomorrow, the acquisition would go public. And the headlines wouldn't just mention Stratus Tech. They'd mention my name. What happens when the sibling rivalry fades, and all that's left is the truth they never dared to face? Have you ever stood across from someone you love and realized they never really saw you until now? Stay with us for Chapter 5, where public recognition meets private reckoning and family pride is tested in front of the world. Chapter 5. The Recalibration. The morning after a family storm is never loud. It's the hush that unnerves you. The house smelled like cinnamon and leftover disappointment. Sunlight crept in through the kitchen windows, catching flecks of dust in the air like glitter that didn't belong. Plates were stacked in the sink, wine glasses abandoned on the sideboard. The remnants of Easter celebration and chaos had settled into a quiet that was almost performative. I sat at the breakfast nook alone, stirring a second cup of coffee I didn't need. Across the kitchen, Heather leaned against the counter, her arms folded. She hadn't spoken much last night after Ethan's blow-up, and even now, her silence carried more weight than words. Finally, she broke it. So, you're the reason Ethan's still got a roof over his head? I didn't respond immediately. I just lifted my mug and took a sip. He's not mad at you, she continued. Not really. He's mad that you were right, and that you didn't need him to be. I met her eyes. He'll come around. Heather gave a small laugh. Funny. You sound more like his older sister than his little one. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Ethan appeared, unshaven, hair tousled, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a wrinkled hoodie. He looked like a version of himself I hadn't seen in years. Raw, real, no veneer. Morning, he mumbled. Heather raised an eyebrow. There's coffee. Try not to take it as a power move. Ethan didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. He poured himself a cup, then sat down across from me at the nook. For a moment, it was just the sound of spoons and mugs and breathing. I owe you an apology, he said finally, not looking at me, for dinner, for the last 10 years, for acting like you were background noise. I didn't expect those words, not from him, not like this, and somehow that made them hit harder. I appreciate it, I said. But I don't need you to shrink to make space for me. I just need you to see that I was already standing there. He nodded slowly. I do now. Heather watched us like she couldn't decide if this was heartwarming or a live TED Talk. A few minutes later, the rest of the family filtered in. Grandma, Aunt Carol, even Dad. The tension from last night hadn't evaporated. but it had softened. There was a strange sense of curiosity in the air, like everyone was still trying to reconfigure where we all stood. It was Grandma who said what no one else dared to. "Lauren, we looked you up this morning." I blinked. "You? What?" She smiled. "Stratos Tech, Strategic Acquisitions. Your name's on half a dozen deals in the last 3 years. Forbes even did a spotlight piece. You didn't think we'd be curious after last night?" I could feel the flush creep up my neck. Dad cleared his throat. "I read the article. Impressive stuff. I didn't know you were doing work at that level. I never tried to hide it," I said quietly. I just stopped bringing it up when no one asked. And now they were all listening, but I wasn't sure if they were hearing pride or guilt in their own silence. "I guess we never really asked," Dad said, rubbing the back of his neck like the words itched. I gave him a small smile. "It's okay. I didn't exactly push to be seen either." He looked at me for a beat longer than I expected. Something unreadable in his eyes, maybe regret, maybe recognition. Then he nodded, a quiet gesture of acceptance that didn't need to be louder than it was. Breakfast turned into a casual family debrief. Grandma launched into a tangent about her neighbor's grandson working in tech or finance, maybe both. Ethan surprisingly didn't bristle when Stratos came up again. He even asked a few thoughtful questions, real ones, the kind that didn't come with ego attached. At one point, I caught him glancing toward Dad as if silently asking, "Are you proud of her now?" The old part of me waited for the usual deflection, the subtle recentering of the spotlight. But Dad didn't deflect. He nodded, just once, and it meant more than any compliment he could have spoken out loud. Later that afternoon, we all stepped out onto the back patio. The air smelled like grass and blooming azaleas, the quiet hum of lawn mowers in neighboring yards adding texture to the spring day. Ethan and I stood side by the railing while the others chatted nearby. "So, what now?" he asked, squinting into the sunlight. "What do you mean?" I replied. "I mean, we've had the blow-up, the truth, the weirdly intimate family breakfast. Are we good now? Or is this just the eye of the storm?" I chuckled. "I think it's a recalibration, not a reset. Nothing's erased, Ethan. But maybe we're finally operating on the same frequency." He nodded slowly. "You know, I'd like to learn more about what you actually do. Maybe there's even a way to work together." I looked at him, searching for sarcasm. There was none. "You serious?" "Dead serious," he said. "You see things I don't." "Always have. Maybe it's time I started treating that like an asset instead of a threat." It was an olive branch I hadn't expected, but one I wasn't going to reject. "All right," I said, a hint of a grin forming. "Then you better start brushing up on equity structuring and post-merger integration." "Oh, God," he groaned. "You're going to make me read, aren't you?" Relentlessly. He laughed, and for a moment we were just siblings, no power plays, no scorecards. That evening, as I packed to leave, Mom appeared in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, still decorated in faded lavender and old track medals. "I wanted to say something before you go," she said. I turned, surprised to see her without the usual social mask. Her eyes were softer, her voice quieter. "You've become someone remarkable, Lauren. And not just professionally. The way you handled all of this, with grace, restraint, strength. I couldn't have done it." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. "I hope you know," she continued, "you were never invisible, just quiet. And maybe we mistook that for absence." I swallowed. "Thank you. That means more than you know." We hugged, gently, like we were both afraid it might break if we tried too hard. As I wheeled my suitcase toward the front door, Ethan stood by the entryway. "Don't be a stranger," he said. Seriously, let's not wait for another crisis. Deal, I replied. And next time, I expect you to pick up the tab at brunch. He grinned. If your company hasn't bought the place by then. We both laughed. But as I drove off into the dusk, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Stratos Tech finalizes Nexera acquisition, the deal behind the disruption. And for the first time, my name was in the head. Tomorrow, the world would know exactly who I was, whether they were ready or not. What happens when the world finally sees your name, but not the years of silence behind it? Have you ever received the recognition you deserved, only to wonder if it came too late? Join me in Chapter 6, where the spotlight shines brighter, the sibling rivalry finds its unexpected ending. Chapter 6. Parallel Tracks. Sometimes the greatest shift doesn't feel like an explosion. It feels like two lives finally moving in the same direction. 3 months passed like a new rhythm you didn't realize you'd already memorized. The headline from the acquisition had faded from the front page, but its ripple effects were everywhere. My inbox was flooded for weeks. Recruiters, analysts, congratulatory emails from people who had ignored me at networking events just 6 months prior. But the attention wasn't what stayed with me. It was the call I got from Ethan 3 days after the announcement. "Okay," he said without preamble. "I read the deal twice, and the white paper you co-authored. I didn't understand half of it, but I want in. If you're serious about building something, maybe we could do it together." I paused, long enough for him to panic a little. "I'm serious," he added quickly. "No games. No ego. Just, maybe you let me shadow you for a while, learn your side of the business." That's how it began. My brother, once the golden child who never listened, became a surprisingly humble apprentice. We started small. Weekly check-ins over coffee in a downtown cafe near my office. I'd assign him light analysis on target markets, let him sit in on a few internal strategy calls. Nothing sensitive, nothing high stakes. Just enough to make him see how much depth there was beyond the flashy headlines he used to chase. And to his credit, he showed up every time, on time, sometimes with questions so thoughtful I had to pause and reevaluate my assumptions. It was strange, this new version of Ethan. Curious, collaborative, still impulsive in ways that drove me a little crazy, but now open to being wrong. One Thursday morning, we stood in front of a glass board in a Stratos Tech conference room, sketching out a potential framework for a new AI-adjacent startup Ethan had been exploring. "I think the user adoption curve will flatten unless we incentivize integrations early," he said, circling a data point. I raised an eyebrow. "You read the case study from yesterday?" He nodded. "Twice, and I finally understood why you pushed so hard on keeping R&D in-house, control of the narrative." I smiled. "Exactly." The door opened. My mentor, Grace Monroe, one of the founding partners at Stratos, peeked in. "Lauren, you have a minute?" I stepped out with her into the hallway, where the air was cooler and the sound of keyboards softened behind glass. "You've made quite an impression," Grace said, "not just with the acquisition, with how you've handled this partnership." I tilted my head. "You mean Ethan?" "I mean the way you've built a bridge without lowering your standards," she replied. "Most people bend. You didn't. You taught." I felt a warmth in my chest that wasn't pride, but something quieter, something that felt like peace. "He's learning," I said. She smiled. "And so are you." We stood in silence for a beat longer than necessary. Then she added, "When you're ready to pitch the new concept, the board will listen." "Say the word," I nodded, but even as I returned to the room a thought lingered. This time, when I stepped into the spotlight, I wouldn't be alone. We called it Project Redwood. Not because it had anything to do with forestry, but because of what redwoods symbolized. Deep roots, silent strength, growth that outlives storms. Ethan had the spark, I had the structure. Together, we started to sketch the architecture of a new kind of platform, something that leveraged his instincts in consumer engagement and my experience with scalable infrastructure. It wasn't about the money, not this time. It was about reclaiming something we hadn't known we'd lost: trust, respect, maybe even kinship. 3 weeks into the project, we met Dad for dinner, a modest steakhouse in Palo Alto. No holiday tension, no pressure. Just 3 people sitting at a round table, clinking glasses and trying to recalibrate a lifetime of imbalance. "You two working together now, huh?" he asked, slicing into his ribeye with casual precision. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. "I'd call it a cautiously optimistic collaboration," I said. Dad smirked. "Sounds like a term sheet waiting to happen," but then he added, "It suits you, both of you, and I'm proud." It wasn't the first time I'd heard those words from someone, but hearing them from him, unprompted, unqualified, landed somewhere I didn't know was still raw. After dinner, as Ethan waited for the valet, Dad pulled me aside. "Lauren," he said, his tone lower. "I wasn't always fair. I see that now." "You don't have to," I started. "I do," he cut in. "You were never loud about your wins, and I think I mistook that for smallness, but you were just building something bigger than ego." I didn't cry, but the silence between us carried all the weight of what we hadn't said for decades. It was enough. The next week, I brought Ethan with me to a Stratos Tech panel. Not as a guest, he was on stage beside me. The room was packed. Investors, founders, students. The moderator asked pointed questions, the kind that used to make Ethan defensive. But this time, he stayed grounded, real, candid. He even cracked a joke about his failed crypto venture. The audience laughed, but more than that, they listened. When it was my turn to speak, I glanced at Ethan beside me. His brow furrowed as he jotted down a note, still learning, and I realized something. This wasn't just a collaboration, it was a restoration. Later, as we stepped off the stage to polite applause and several business cards pressed into our hands, Ethan turned to me. "You know," he said, "there was a time I thought being the smartest guy in the room was the point, and now? Now, I know the smartest person in the room is usually the one asking better questions." I grinned. "Took you long enough?" We stood on the mezzanine, overlooking the city skyline as the sun dipped below the glass towers. It felt like a beginning, on equal footing. That night, I found myself alone in my apartment, barefoot, glass of wine in hand, rereading an old email draft I never sent. It was addressed to myself. Subject line, "Someday they'll see you." I smiled and deleted it. I didn't need it anymore. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "I've been thinking Redwood could scale faster if we brought in a third partner, someone from outside, neutral. You trust Grace?" I stared at the screen. A new door opening. A bigger future unfolding, but before I could reply, another message popped up, this time from Stratos HQ. "Urgent. Board requesting early meeting. Bennett acquisition path." My name, my trajectory, my next big move. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was just arriving. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you saw a part of yourself in Lauren's quiet strength, her resilience, or the long road to finally being seen, know that you're not alone. Sometimes the ones who've been overlooked the longest carry the most powerful truths, and when they choose to rise, they don't just change their own story, they shift the entire narrative. To everyone out there building quietly, healing slowly, and standing tall despite the odds, this one was for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to FM Revenge for more powerful stories just like this, because every voice deserves to be heard, even the ones that took the longest to speak.